As I mentioned at the beginning of the Mass, today, the fourth Sunday of Lent, is Rose Sunday. And we have this Rose Sunday also in Advent. And the reason for this Sunday and the reason for the priest wearing lighter rose-colored vestments is that traditionally both the season of Lent and the season of Advent was very severe. In other words, the penances that people undertook during this period of preparation for Christmas and for Easter was so severe that it was seen as prudent to put in a day where the Lenten penances would be relaxed for the people, but also liturgically. So we have the lighter color, which is more bright, more cheerful color, we could say. But also on this day, for example, musical instruments are allowed to be played, not just to accompany singing, but they can be played on their own. And also on this day, if we wanted to, we could actually use some flowers to decorate. So during the season of Lent, we don't do those things, partially as a kind of liturgical penance. And when we think of the rose color, it's really a combination of purple and white. So at Easter, the priest would wear white colors, sometimes gold or silver. But anyways, if you mix purple and white, you get kind of a rose or a kind of pinkish color, hence the color for today's vestments. And of course, thinking of Easter and the white vestments and the joy of Easter, it kind of points to today's readings in which there is the contrast between light and darkness, and also the ability to see and the ability not to see or to be blind. Talk of physical blindness, but also a kind of spiritual blindness also. Notice in today's second reading, St. Paul writing to the Ephesians, he says, "Brothers and sisters, once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light." What does that mean? Brothers and sisters, once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. How do we understand that? So recall how I had mentioned that when we are separated from God, we are basically in darkness. Our soul is darkened. If we commit, even if we are baptized and if we commit a mortal sin, we lose the grace of God, so our soul is darkened, our soul is stained by our sinfulness. But when we are baptized, or if we go to confession after having committed a mortal sin, God dwells in our soul, and God is the light of the world. He illuminates our souls. He cleanses our soul by his presence of the stain of sin. And this is very appropriate, especially when we consider today's gospel reading. Notice that our Lord didn't just heal the blind man's eyes. He put mud on his eyes, mixed with his spittle, and he goes and tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And part of the reason we have this gospel passage today is because those who are preparing to become Catholic, their preparation is actually intensified during the Lenten season. And it's kind of a reminder to them that those who are to be baptized, it's kind of like they're going to the pool of Siloam, and there's mud on their eyes, or rather there's a stain on their soul, and God is going to wash away their sins. God is going to illuminate them by his presence. God is going to shine through their souls. So St. Paul says, not only are you light, but you are children of the light, and so live as children of the light. In other words, we are called to manifest to others the goodness of Christ within us. In other words, the light of Christ should radiate through us, through our actions, through our behavior, onto everyone else, by our good deeds, by doing the things that we are supposed to be doing and avoiding those things that we're supposed to be avoiding. Now, in today's gospel reading, this man is blind from birth. And notice the disciples of our Lord asked him, "Lord, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, of course, he couldn't have sinned before birth, but the point is that the Jewish people had this understanding, had this belief that if anybody suffered in any way, it was either due to their own sins or to their parents' sins or their grandparents. So someone in the family tree. This is why they're asking this question. Now, it is true that when we sin, we do experience misery and bad things, maybe not right away, but we do. And it's important that we realize this, okay? It's also true, however, that not everyone who suffers is suffering on account of their own sins or their parents' or grandparents' sins. So in other words, suffering is a part of life. So suffering and death entered into the world through the sin of Adam and Eve. And when we look at the lives of some of the great saints, some of them suffered terribly, even though they were very good and their parents were probably very good also. So suffering is a part of life. We need to accept suffering. And if we do, God can use that suffering for good, as God does in today's gospel reading. In this case, the man is healed of his blindness, but we can unite our sufferings with the sufferings of Christ and obtain more graces for ourselves or people in the entire world. Now notice that this man who is born blind, he receives his sight. He is miraculously healed of his sight by our Lord. But the Pharisees, they have a hard time accepting this. So the man testifies to the Pharisees. He was healed. He explains how he was healed. Some of the people who knew him, who had seen him, also testify, yeah, this is the man who was born blind. Now he's healed. And not only that, his parents come and testify also. So in other words, the evidence, the testimony of all these people is like overwhelming. And notice what the blind man says to the Pharisees after they refuse to accept his testimony. He says, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind." In other words, this blind man is full of wisdom, and he's saying, look, guys, it's so obvious. He must be from God. He must have the power of God in him and working through him. Therefore, he cannot be a sinner. Therefore, you should listen to him. Basically, that's the message there. But the Pharisees, like it's so obvious, but the Pharisees, they reject all this evidence. In other words, they are choosing to be blind. And this is very important. It's important that we reflect on this because sometimes we too choose to be blind. Now, you and I, we have faith, and our faith informs our vision of the world, how we see the world, how we see our place in the world. As Christians, as followers of our Lord, we have hope for a better world to come. In other words, it makes it easier for us to deal with the difficulties of daily life because we have hope. And we know that our sufferings can be beneficial also for us. So our worldview is that we are called to love others. We are called to sacrifice ourselves or give of ourselves for the good of others. This is our mission in life. We understand this. But imagine for a moment that you were an atheist, a complete atheist. You didn't believe in life after death. You didn't believe in God. You didn't believe in heaven and hell. You just believe all that there is this life. And like everyone else, you too desire happiness. Now, it's true that sometimes, like for people who are wealthy, they just always want more and more and they're never satisfied. But with a lot of people, the things they seek, whether it's sensual pleasure or entertainment, eventually they get tired of it. They realize these things don't make them happy. And if you're an atheist and that's all you have to hope for, after a while you just give up hope. And so it's not surprising that some people struggle through life. Sometimes they become depressed or even suicidal. They don't have real meaning and they just think, oh, it's just all about me. So their whole lives revolve around themselves as opposed to us who try to give of ourselves, which gives real meaning to our lives and helps us to develop good relationships also. So, an atheist, imagine if we were to present an atheist with real evidence, such as the Pharisees had the evidence of the blind man being healed. So imagine, for example, if we told atheists, look, top-notch scientists, right? They're all saying the world could not have come about by chance. The universe, the planet Earth, these things could not have come about by chance. All the criteria needed for life to be capable to have life capable on Earth couldn't come about by chance. So these top-notch scientists, very intellectual scientists, some of them who were former atheists, are now saying intelligent design theory. An intelligent designer, which we call God, had to design and make the world the way that it is. It didn't just come about by chance. The criteria needed for it to come about by chance is just so great that it's not possible. In addition to that, we have all kinds of miracles. And miracles take place in every age, but these miracles are primarily in the Catholic Church. So we have all kinds of great saints, all kinds of miracles, including apparitions. I mean, think, for example, of Our Lady of Fatima in 1917, right? The miracle of the sun, witnessed by 70,000 people, including many atheists, many people who were there just to report on the event who didn't believe at all. So in other words, the evidence is overwhelming. And think, for example, also of the apparitions of Our Lady at Lourdes in 1858 and the miraculous flow of water, and thousands of people have been healed there, and doctors from all different backgrounds can come and investigate these claims of alleged miracles, and so it's very unbiased. It's not like Catholic doctors or anything like that. Or you think even here in Canada, in Montreal, St. Andre Bessette, who died in 1937. Thousands of miracles attributed to him, which he attributed to St. Joseph. So all of these things point to the fact that God exists. And recently, like near-death experiences, there's more and more evidence for that. Recall the movie I had recommended, After Death. It's a documentary on people who've had near-death experiences. And these near-death experiences confirm the existence of life after death, the reality of heaven and hell, as well as the existence of God. So imagine an atheist being presented with this evidence. What's going to be their response? Well, we would hope that they would accept it. Now, I just mentioned a few things. There's way more things that we could talk about. But a lot of atheists, including some who are very intellectual, like top-notch scientists, they see the evidence and they even acknowledge, yeah, this points to the reality of God, but I choose not to accept it. Why? There's always a reason. So often it's for selfish reasons, or for some reason they just choose to not accept it. In other words, they are actually choosing to be blind. So why is it that the Pharisees refused to accept Jesus and his miracles, the testimony of the blind man and everyone else? Well, because Jesus was breaking the Sabbath law. He was making mud. He was performing a miracle on the Sabbath. He's doing work on the Sabbath, therefore he cannot be from God. And others, they have this preconceived idea, and they're not willing to acknowledge that they might be wrong. And you see, many atheists are like that today also. They don't want to change their way of life. So some atheists have acknowledged that the reason is, well, if God exists, then I have to be obedient to God. I cannot live my life the way I want to. So I choose not to believe. And basically what they're saying is, I choose to be blind. Now, like I said, you and I, we can be grateful that we do have faith, but the reality is that sometimes you and I, we too choose to be blind to certain things. There are some Catholics, for example, who pick and choose what they believe about the official teachings of the Catholic Church. Oh, I'll believe this, but not that. That's choosing to be blind. We need to accept everything that Christ has revealed through his church, the church that he established. And not only that, sometimes we tend to want the best of both worlds. It's kind of like, yeah, we know we need to believe in God and practice our faith, and we're going to do that to a certain extent. But at the same time, we want all the good things of this world. Okay, well, we're prudent enough and wise enough to know that we shouldn't commit mortal sin. But yeah, I just want to live a life of luxury. I just want to watch TV all day or social media and whatever, right? I just want to enjoy the good things of this world. And it's not that we shouldn't or can't enjoy the things of this world. We can and we should to a certain extent. But especially during this season of Lent, in other words, do we really understand clearly that it's extremely beneficial for us to do something in those three areas that we're supposed to do something during the season of Lent? In other words, to intensify our prayer life. In other words, grow in my relationship with God. And to practice fasting or self-denial, to deny myself certain things because my tendency is to be selfish, and I need to overcome that. And finally, the third thing is to be more charitable. In other words, think about different ways in which I can be at the service of others. Do I see and understand the value and benefit of doing these things, not just during Lent, but throughout the entire year? And for many of us, the answer is no, I don't see that. I don't understand that. And so perhaps we need to consider, am I blind to certain spiritual truths, certain spiritual realities? Am I selfish? Am I proud? Often we're blind to our own pride. Spiritual authors point out when we root out pride in one area, it pops up in another without our even realizing it. And so let us ask God to enable us to see clearly and to be truly wise in the decisions that we make and how we live our lives.